Recently prodded by Roger Strittmatter, Robert Myers, and Richard Waugaman, I exited the French Middle Ages and ventured into the English Renaissance to survey academic research on Shakespeare and the French connection with the goal of entering the mainstream. I am happy to inform you that new scholarship on Shakespeare and the French connection is toppling traditional Shakespearean doctrine and opening up the field in amazing ways. A preliminary survey reveals a startling about-face in the mainstream academic position concerning Shakespeare's knowledge of French. In his erudite 1910 study entitled The French Renaissance in England, Sir Sidney Lee maintained Shakespeare knew French and was greatly influenced by French authors. In 1919, the great French Renaissance scholar Abel Lefranc examined Shakespeare's knowledge of French culture, society, and geography in Sous le masque de William Shakespeare, William Stanley, Vicomte de Derby. In 1920, Thomas Loney published Shakespeare Identified in Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. It appears that these early studies casting doubt on the merchant's authorship led academics to reject scholarship about foreign influences in Shakespeare's work. Considering the political climate of pre- and post-World War I England, the prejudice against an aristocratic author versus a merchant of the English heartland is not surprising. Questioning the merchant's authorship, the soul of the age, entailed a psychological projection that challenged industrialization, the mercantile system, and faith in every man, substituting a nobleman who represented the worst of an obsolescent, exploitative, and corrupt system. In view of the times, the prejudice is understandable. Less understandably, it has endured and is now stoked by a new wave of anti-intellectualism. What to do? Scholars of French literature are providing the answer, and their example needs to be followed. To avoid confusion, I will refer to Shaksper, the traditional authorship candidate, and to Shakespeare, the author. Academics who favored Shaksper as the author adopted the stance that Shakespeare could only read English or Latin based, with good reason, on what little is known about his education and life experience. Foreign texts could not be considered unless they had been translated into English or Latin, despite the work of early scholars like Sidney Lee. This new consensus immediately created a problem centering on Hamlet, which was undeniably drawn from Belforet's untranslated Histoire d'Hamlet. This awkward problem of an untranslated French source for Shaksper, who could not read French, led to the theory of the Hamlet, an earlier Hamlet which Shakespeare wrote based on a lost translation by Thomas Kidd that was simply assumed to exist because that theory made it possible for Shaksper to have read the French source in English. I cite this example of the fabricated scenarios traditional scholarship has been forced to create to maintain the stance that Shakespeare did not read French texts. When mainstream academia adopted the position that Shakespeare did not know any languages but English and Latin, important scholarship was simply dismissed. Without a thorough study of foreign influences in Shakespeare's poetry and plays, we do not have an understanding of how Shakespeare grew out of the European Renaissance, as Priscilla Costello has just brilliantly illustrated, citing Greek and Platonic influences. This is really an incredible failure, but it is also a great opportunity. We need a study of the intellectual Shakespeare, something like, and let's see if this works now, something like Shakespeare, a Renaissance man, a book that would examine with textual analysis Shakespeare's vast knowledge of not only foreign texts, but his knowledge of French, Italian, law, medicine, art, on and on and on. Oxfordians excel at this kind of study. A different Oxfordian specialist could write each chapter. As we shall see, academia is now open to studies like this thanks to the French connection. This book could be directed towards academics, but it could also have a much broader audience. The catch is not to mention any name other than Shakespeare, but with a mousetrap strategy we can discuss later. A subject like this is also invaluable because it could attract scholars from Europe who would be delighted for a change to be consulted. And I mean mainland Europe. Considering French was only spoken by the upper nobility by the 15th, not the 16th, by the 15th century, the English project makes an astounding statement. The vast majority of Shakespeare's vocabulary comes from French. More profoundly, much of the grammar and the syntax of Shakespeare's language comes from French. This assessment was made by Christopher Mulvey, Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Winchester, a trustee for the English Project. According to academics, the only people still speaking French in the 16th century in England were the upper aristocracy, academics, or wool and wine merchants trading directly with French merchants. In a personal email, Diana Price, author of Shakespeare's unorthodox biography, affirmed that there is nothing in the historical record indicating that Shaksper knew French. Scholars have long been puzzled by why there is so much French in Shakespeare's works, because a London audience of the 16th century could not understand French. As George Watson observes, the French scenes in Henry V are surprising, not just that Shakespeare could write them, but that he should expect a London audience in 1599 to understand them. The French language in Shakespeare's plays was, of course, directed to an audience that could understand it. The only such English audience at the time was the upper aristocracy. Shakespeare is the only Elizabethan author to write at length in French precisely because he was writing for the upper aristocracy. How extensive was Shakespeare's knowledge of French? Was it simply a smattering that he could have gotten help with, as traditional scholars have maintained, or does it permeate his work? Sidney Lee observes that Shakespeare gave the use of French words a new vogue. Shakespeare uses French words when there are English words that could be used. For example, sans, meaning without, and as you like it. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Why the gouts of blood on the dagger Macbeth hallucinates, gouts meaning drops, unless Shakespeare was telling his audience that the play is not simply a Scottish play, but also a play dealing with French blood. And if it deals with French blood, it is also about English blood, as we shall see. In some cases, Shakespeare's French usage was adopted into English, for example, malcontent. Shakespeare uses the ending ure based on the French ending eur, and I'm quoting here from Sidney Lee, more liberally than any contemporary English writer. Shakespeare is also fond of words ending in ance, for example, abidance. He coins individual English words based on French, for example, omittance, deracinate, incave, rejoinder, exposture, rumorer. He uses puns that require knowledge of French. Example, gown and foot in Henry V. Charbon, charbonne, and poisson, in All's Well That Ends Well. Alexander Dice includes 69 French references in his 1902 glossary to the works of William Shakespeare. And Bonner, yesterday, gave us another lovely example in the 10 letters with the word obscurement. Here, De Vere adds ment to obscure, a French word, a word of French derivation. Shakespeare's use of French needs intensive study. A recent article about one French word Shakespeare uses in Hamlet provides an example of this kind of research, published in a mainstream journal. Traditional scholars have long maintained that Shakespeare read Montaigne in Fleuriot's translation, not in the original French. Travis William observes, however, that Shakespeare uses Montaigne's French word bourne, not Fleuriot's English translation boundary. It is therefore impossible to maintain that Shakespeare did not read Montaigne in French, especially because Shakespeare has a marked fondness for the word bourne and proceeds to use the word throughout his work. Again, Shakespeare's use of French words, his French neologisms, his French syntax, and puns present another opportunity to collect papers on these topics for a book about Shakespeare's French. This type of study would be of interest to mainstream publishers here and in France. We need to look for international allies. They are out there. We just haven't, fettered them out. Sidney Lee noted the influence of French poets of the Pléiades, a group of 16th century Renaissance poets, of whom the most famous is Ronsard. Lee notes their influence in Shakespeare's creation of new words and the use of double epithets, which Shakespeare uses frequently. Many of Shakespeare's double epithets are still used today, for example, Snow White, health-giving. In Shakespeare's sonnets in the Court of Navarre, David Honeyman observes that in the sonnets, Shakespeare even uses French words with their French as opposed to their English meanings, which are different. In my opinion, in these instances, Shakespeare is playing with both meanings of the word because he is writing for a high-ranking noble audience that understood both French and English. The vestigial remains of the continental octave, which Honeyman observes in nearly two-thirds of Shakespeare's sonnets, as well as imagery, vocabulary, and stylistic devices drawn from the Pleiad poets, are yet additional indications that whoever wrote the sonnets was heavily steeped in the French-Italian sonnet tradition. Because Shakespeare's knowledge of French is so profound, Honeyman concludes that Shakespeare must have been French. Or, I would counter, someone steeped in French from an early age with a French obsession that manifests itself throughout the plays. The influence of French poetry on Shakespeare's sonnets and long poems has been barely addressed and needs intensive study. Now let's see if we can find. Yes, here we go. Shakespeare and the French Poets. Another collection of essays for mainstream publication. And then here, what do you know, this weekend, I discover that Jan Shaksper and Ron Hess are undertaking the first study of Shakespeare, and I mean an intensive study of Shakespeare and a French poet, Desportes. This is a profoundly important study which mainstream publishers will be interested in. Since 1914, several books have been published on Shakespeare's sources. The most recent, Shakespeare's Books, A Dictionary of Shakespeare's Sources by Stuart Gillespie, appeared in a paperback edition in 2016 and includes 175 sources. Other scholars list up to 200. These, of course, are the Oxfordians. Unfortunately, as Diana Price points out in Shakespeare's Unorthodox biography, Gillespie follows a traditional academic mold. Traditional scholars minimize the influence of a French source if there is an English translation. Here is a list I have compiled including the most recent studies of Shakespeare's French sources. To date, there are more than 30. Of the 30, 6 were not available in translation for Shakespeare, but this is now totally irrelevant since Williams has now proven Shakespeare could read French. Now, Stratfordians are beginning to say, oh, Shakespeare could read French and Italian. Faced with an ever-growing number of French sources, some untranslated in Shakespeare's day, traditional academics are now trying to explain how Shakespeare could have learned French. In Shakespeare's Unorthodox biography, Diana Price notes that traditional scholars now assume Shaksper hired French tutors during the lost years, 1585 to 92, or learned French when he roomed for a year with the Montjoie, a French Huguenot family in London. However, as Price observes, the problem with the Montjoie or Montjoie theory is that Shakespeare had already written several plays influenced by French sources, including Henry V and Hamlet, before he roomed with the Montjoie family. Even the duration of the lost years has to be questioned because Raymond Jimenez has found evidence Henry V was performed as early as 1583. Traditional scholars are desperately trying to explain how Shaksper somehow attained the level of French fluency found throughout his work, the access to both published and unpublished French texts, some of which came, some of the sources are actually from personal journals, as well as his knowledge of the French aristocracy, geography, art, and on and on. The French floodgates have been opened and cannot be closed. Now, this is the sources. One of the earliest examples of this new trend is Hugh Richmond's Puritans and Libertines, Anglo-French Literary Relations in the Reformation, published in 1981. Richmond traces the influence of Marguerite de Navarre's Heptameron in Shakespeare's work, noting that she helped, quote, tune the sensibilities of Elisabeth and to set the tone for her court playwright Shakespeare. I suggest all of you not familiar with this important study, read it as a guide on how to address foreign influences in Shakespeare's work. Richmond accentuates the human experience, the psychological dimension within the historical text, which keeps the text relevant and meaningful. Richmond is a traditional Stratfordian, perhaps. He leaves it very ambiguous. Bravo. A more recent example of this sea change in academics is Richard Hillman's The French Origins of English Tragedy, published in 2012. Now, this is very important. Hillman delves into the French influence without asking the traditional questions that used to limit traditional academics. He lets the works speak for themselves, never bringing up the authorship question, never fantasizing about how Shaksper could be reading Jodelle, a minor Pleiad poet, who happened to be the author of the first French classical tragedy, Cléopâtre Captive, and comedy, Eugène. Hillman doesn't ask how or why. He lets the texts speak for themselves. The ever-increasing flood of scholarship on the French influence in Shakespeare's work has burst the dam of traditional academics, thanks also in part to the multiple authorship theory, which permits the entry of sophisticated knowledge into Shakespeare's writing. The multiple authorship theory is the last-ditch effort to save Shaksper as author, because if Shaksper was collaborating with multiple well-educated authors, then no explanation is needed for how he knew French or Latin or French or Italian or Greek. No explanation is needed for how he knew intimate details about the French aristocracy, French and Italian cities and geography, French and Italian artwork. The longer the list of collaborative authors become, the more incredible it is that for the 70 historical records we have for Shaksper, not one, and I'm quoting Diana Price here, not one reveals his supposed primary professional occupation of writing. Sources are critical because they are key to Shakespeare's creative genius. He was reading the same stories in Italian, French, English, Latin, Spanish, Greek, and in as many different sources as possible, because each source had a slightly different prism. And now here in the rest of this paragraph, you're going to hear echoes of Skye Gilbert's presentation. Shakespeare was blending all of these stories with the events of his day. By fusing all of these prisms and adding his own, Shakespeare refracts an astounding array of psychological and cultural tensions. All this complexity is added, Add to this complexity the medieval and Renaissance concept of multiple levels of meaning in a text, the literal, the allegorical historical, and the anagogical, that is the spiritual, and you begin to understand the dizzying complexity of Shakespeare. As Ben Jonson tells us, Shakespeare was the soul of the age, a mirror into the complex world of Renaissance thought. This psychological and cultural complexity helps explain why Shakespeare's works are still so popular. Shakespeare's plays, even his comedies, always leave us with an odd feeling of malaise. Because as with the Rubens vase image, we sense the different realities, the paradoxes, the both and, as opposed to the either or. It is only with paradox that we discover the complexity of truth. The multiple cultural aspects of Shakespeare's works need to be addressed because Shakespeare's multiculturalism makes his work timeless. Another collection of essays with a title something like Shakespeare and the European Renaissance, ideally bringing in French and Italian and even German. I mean, just look all over Europe for like-minded scholars and make this an international effort, because this is what it needs to be. I'm looking here, Catherine Attingue. Is she here? This is our French connection. In addition to the complexities introduced by his many sources, Shakespeare's love-hate relationship with France and the French adds yet another dimension to his work. Since 1066, the English have had a love-hate relationship with the French. In Shakespeare's day, the French influence hangs heavy in the air between 1534 and 1558, with Elizabeth's 4 French suitors, and from 1562 to 1598, with the mirror of the religious wars England hoped to avert. Shakespeare's history plays portray the French-English clash overtly. However, this fraught relationship continues throughout all of Shakespeare's work, in what scholars have described as the anxiety of influence. Shakespeare lived in a world of dual ancestry, mirrored not only in English history and law, but also in English language and art. Although Shakespeare voraciously read French poetry, plays, and history, he never fails to mock the French, which provides a psychological means for Shakespeare to assert an English sense of superiority and masculinity. This tension between the clash of English and French cultures also explains why Shakespeare's works are so easily adapted to global and cultural conflicts. This paradoxical love-hate theme runs throughout Shakespeare's works, and here is yet another collection of essays, Shakespeare's love-hate relationship with the French. In 1962, Georges Lambin published the landmark study Voyage de Shakespeare en France et en Italie, a scholarly work in which he proves Shakespeare had an intimate knowledge not only of the French and Italian court, but also French and Italian geography, with accurate travel times and enough geographic detail to reveal locations still extant today in both France and Italy. In addition to geographic accuracy, Lambin clarifies anecdotes and observes a wealth of detail about the French court which are impossible to explain unless Shakespeare had spent some time in France with the nobility. Lambin even includes a visual reference to a French tapestry. In Much Ado About Nothing, Borachio provides a strange observation about a tapestry now restored in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. All right, let me see if I can do this. If you look at Hercules, who's the central figure in the tapestry, who's being burned alive, and you look in his groin area, you are going to be a little flummoxed by what is it exactly that you're looking at, and obviously Shakespeare was also. And what Borachio says, which is quite amusing, is like the shaven Hercules in the smirched, worm-eaten tapestry where his codpiece seems as massy as his club. Now, this if you look down underneath the fire by the gentleman's foot, where you can see his backside, by his foot you will see the club of Hercules, which is quite large. So leave it to Shakespeare to make an observation like this. It obviously made an lasting impression even today. And appropriately, the word massy is a word of French derivation. Lambin also notes occasional snippets of Gascon and Provençal. We have several Shakespeare in Italy books published by mainstream publishers. We need a book on Shakespeare in France. All that needs to be done is to collect the work of Lefranc, Lambin, and other 19th and early 20th century English, German, and Italian scholars, update it, and publish it. Julia Cleave has already begun this work with the Shakespeare Authorship Trust 2014 presentations. If you have not listened to those, please do. That is the Shakespeare Authorship Trust 2014 presentations, and the subject of that conference was Shakespeare and the French Connection. So all that she has to do now is collect the essays they've already written, write a few more, and that book is done. Another subject that seems pretty clear after studying the French influence in the plays is that many of the plays are older than previously thought. A careful examination of the events in French history referred to in the plays will inevitably pose problems for the Stratfordian dating system. This is yet another subject to be addressed in an article. To put the conspiracy theory about an author with a pseudonym permanently to rest, we need an article comparing Shakespeare and Molière, often described as the French Shakespeare, because Molière is a nom de plume. His real name was Poquelin. Indeed, all French playwrights writing plays with social criticism used a nom de plume. Understanding why Molière used a pseudonym will help make it clear not only why Shakespeare did the same, but also why a pseudonym does not require a vast conspiracy theory. Finally, important means of getting into the mainstream would be a collection of study notes for teachers and students. Something like Shakespeare Made Clear notes or Shakespeare Authorship notes. Something that would provide a historical background, which is now totally missing from the Shakespeare online notes about the plays. And this would be a way to reach the younger generation. So thanks to the French Connection, there is a wealth of material that needs to be addressed. All of its subject matter that will appeal to mainstream presses. It's already happening. The Shakespeare merchant myth is crumbling. Oxfordians have so much to offer that is now of interest to mainstream publishers. Diplomacy is required for now, it's true. But that's okay. There are mousetrap strategies available. Paradigm shifts occur slowly. The great news is that we are witnessing the beginning of the shift.